Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Pierce, and the focus is Stumbles in War. The year is 1847. It's about a year into the Mexican War, and the Polk administration has decided to adjust its strategy. It's now going to have its main thrust to try to get to Mexico City, the Mexican capital, by landing troops in the Gulf of Mexico on the beaches of Veracruz, where a solid fortress was there to protect, but if the Americans could win that battle, then they can head straight west, capture Mexico City, force capitulation, win the war. Major General Winfield Scott has actually already taken that fortress with an impressive 20-day siege that is victorious by the time Brigadier General Franklin Pierce arrives with some of his men to support that effort on the march to Mexico City. Unfortunately, they are short on supplies. They are short on transportation. So while Scott and his men get a head start, Pierce and his have to sit and wait for more supplies, transportation materials to come together. And their biggest concern is getting sick. The stomach virus that is circulating through this region, they called it the vomito, was the biggest enemy that they were worried about because it could be deadly. And so Pierce actually took his men a couple of miles away from Veracruz to camp out, wait for those supplies to come together. By the middle of July 1847, they are good to go. He's got 2,500 men, 85 wagons of supplies and ammunition ready to go. Get up on that march to sync up with General Scott at Pueblo. That was the target. Well, the enemy was also in play, and they were going to try to stop General Pierce from making that trek. First encountered the enemy on July 20th with a small skirmish, not much there, but the next day was a bigger engagement. At the National Bridge over the Rio de Antigua, Mexican dragoons were on that bridge. They were stationed to defend it, also had some well-entrenched artillery up in the hills above, and General Pierce had to figure out how to get his men across. Well, his own artillery was able to clear the bridge of the dragoons pretty quickly, but he had trouble trying to figure out how to get that entrenched artillery that was providing the covering fire. He decided to send a small unit in a blitz across the bridge. He thought he could get them across quickly enough, their enemy artillery couldn't do any damage, and then they could then scale the hills, get rid of that artillery unit, and open up the bridge to cross. And it worked nearly to perfection. That unit went across, scaled the hills, got the artillery group out, and Brigadier General Franklin Pierce had his first victory. He also almost lost his life. It was close. He had a bullet, took his hat right off his head. He wasn't worried though. He was happy, pleased that he had that first good outcome. Finally reached General Scott at Pueblo August 6th, and Scott was anxious. He was ready to go, waiting for those supplies. So the very next day, they are on their route to Mexico City. They were looking to try to find and flank Major General Antonio de Lopez de Santa Anna, who was leading the Mexican troops. Pierce was fighting under Major General Gideon, another political general officer. He was from Tennessee, and their orders were to remove the Mexicans at the town of Contreras, open a path to the capital, and to do that, they had to do a route through a pretty tough terrain. It was called the Pedregal. That was described as it looked as if a raging sea of molten rock had instantly congealed, had then been filled by the storms of centuries with fissures, caves, jagged points, and lurking pitfalls. Pretty imposing. And that terrain took its toll, specifically on General Pierce. His horse slipped on some of those rocks. It fell. He was crushed under the horse. He also had his groin struck the pommel of his saddle on the way down. Again, crushed. His left knee was particularly injured. He was out. He was knocked unconscious initially, and before he could finally get up, there was a reaction amongst his men, and it was perhaps not what he would have liked. Colonel George Morgan shouted out when he saw that the general was down to another colonel, Trueman Ransom, "Take command of the brigade. General Pierce is a damned coward." Now, that was unfair, it was uninformed in terms of what Morgan claimed, but a lot of people heard it, and that claim would carry forward through the propaganda of future political campaigns, perhaps against General Pierce. Again, pretty uninformed and unfair, but it did take him out of action, at least for the time being. He was out for about a half hour before he finally sort of was back up, regained his senses, got a new horse, and he eventually was able to rejoin his men. They were involved in a fight. It was inconclusive. Nightfall came. He brought his men back into the Pedregal. He was working the entire time. In fact, he was on his horse in the saddle until about 11 o'clock that night before he finally had a chance to take a rest on the back of an ammunition wagon in the midst of a driving rain. Pretty tough day for General Pierce. Well, then he got woken in the middle of the night because he had to wait work with his fellow officers to try to prepare for battle the next day, to try to finish off the Mexicans at Contreras. And Pierce's job the next day was really to be a diversion for other units to go and take on the Mexicans and open up that path. That work was done to perfection, but it was done without General Pierce. He was too injured to engage. Colonel Ransom led the men to that successful venture. After the victory at Contreras, General Scott and his men got to within 10 miles of Mexico City. They were planning an attack on the town of Churubusco, where the Mexicans were trying to make a stand. General Scott called his officers together, and Brigadier General Franklin Pierce, enfeebled, barely unable to stay in his saddle, came to this meeting. And General Scott said, "Pierce, my dear fellow, you are badly injured. You are not fit to be in your saddle." Pierce protested this remark. He said, "I'm fine for duty." Well, Scott said, "You are rash, General Pierce. We shall lose you, and we cannot spare you. It is my duty to order you back to St. Augustine." And Pierce then pleaded with him, "For God's sake, General, don't say that. This is the last great battle, and I must lead my brigade." Well, General Scott relented, and frankly, this was poor judgment on both their parts, because again, the terrain was difficult, there were storms, the ditches in the ground were waterlogged, so Pierce had to get off his horse, try to walk through this difficult terrain. He got about 300 yards, and he fainted. It was likely from the pain in his left knee, which was still pretty overwhelming. The men rallied under Colonel Ransom, and they were successful, but for this fight, again, Brigadier General Pierce nowhere to be found. He did perform his duty in the next step in the campaign, because the Mexicans asked for an armistice after another loss at Churubusco, and Scott appointed Pierce as one of the 3 officers to lead the negotiations, which took place at the home of the British consul nearby Tacubaya on August 22nd now of 1847. And sure enough, the military operations were suspended and armistice went into effect pending the long-term peace negotiations. Some of the men, though, in the ranks weren't very happy about this. They wanted the glory of storming the gates of Mexico City and earning that final victory under arms. But this was not the thinking of General Pierce. He wrote his wife Jane that from the beginning to the end of that conference, my attention was directed solely to the great object of an honorable peace. And all the denunciations the next day of men and officers whose thoughts seemed to have been fixed upon a revel in the halls produced no more effect upon my feelings than has sometimes an outbreak of undeserved praise. He was focused on the task. He was pleased with the armistice agreement, but it didn't last. In fact, General Scott, after just several days, realized that there were violations on the Mexican side, and he ordered the resumption of the attacks. He was going to get to Mexico City one way or another, and the armistice wasn't working, so he was back to the battle. Well, Franklin Pierce and his men were mostly in reserve in that next battle. They were going after what was believed to be a cannon factory in the town of Molina del Rey. They were successful there, and that had set up the final push. The big final barrier, Chapultepec Castle. This was not going to be easy. This castle was built with high walls on top of a 200-foot hill, and Pierce's men would have to, they were in the center of this. His 9th Infantry were right front and center, and they had to get ladders out to storm under withering fire, to then scale those walls on ladders, again with shots coming directly down upon them. This was going to be a difficult fight. It was successful, but Franklin Pierce was once again nowhere to be found. In this case, it was an intense case of diarrhea. He was too ill to participate. So he was back guarding the supplies while Colonel Ransom took the lead, and this was an impactful day for Colonel Ransom. He was killed in action. He was one of those who was actually shot from above while trying to scale those walls. He was lost, but the men were successful, and this effectively ended the fighting in the Mexican War. Because after the victory at Chapultepec, General Santa Anna and his men left Mexico City. They basically left General Scott the ability to walk in and take the city to wait for the final negotiations, and a peace would eventually come. Well, while those peace negotiations were going on, the men really had nothing to do. They were pretty bored. Franklin Pierce, he got a furlough, a 90-day furlough, and he left Mexico for good on December 9th, stopped in Washington, D.C. on his way back to New Hampshire. He met with President Polk. He met with Secretary of War William Marcy, some brief discussions about how things went in the battle and in the campaign. January 27th, 1848, he comes back to New Hampshire, and in Concord, he gets a big reception. He's brought home as a conquering hero. And in fact, he gave an hour-long address to the locals about the big victory and all the accomplishments of he and his men. This sort of was a little mixed messaging, though, because some people did know that General Pierce, he was sort of missing in action in a lot of these battles. In fact, one of the newspapers, the Independent Democrat and Freeman, wrote, "A tiger in battle he certainly is not. We never heard or read of a brave man's fainting on the field of battle without the loss of a single drop of blood. So there were some mixed messages, clearly, but not with Franklin Pierce. In his mind, he had fulfilled his vision of following in his father's footsteps. His father, a soldier throughout the Revolutionary War, and felt good about what he accomplished. The facts don't really support that claim. In fact, if you really look at his performance and his activities in Mexico, there's a strong case to be made that Brigadier General Franklin Pierce was the least impactful general officer of the entire war. That is Franklin Pierce and Stumbles in War from the life of Franklin Pierce. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.